There was a time when I used to enjoy walking at night. It was a way to clear my head, to avoid the stresses of my life. I think it's because I've never enjoyed being around large groups of people. I feel lost in the noise. Walking at night played into that for me. At night, the streets were empty where I lived, even at the weekends. That emptiness felt like an embrace. Once my two sons were in bed and my wife was curled up on our couch with a book, I'd pull on my shoes and just walk. I'd breathe, I'd stroll along darkened pavements, streetlights casting their shadows dimly, and immerse myself in the loneliness of it all. I'd let the night in and give myself up to it. But the perfect peace of those nightly walks was shattered just over 2 years ago. It was April, that strange in-between time where the cold and warm mix with each other. I had been walking for 20 or so minutes. My footsteps scuffed occasionally against the concrete pavements, the sound deadened by the night air. I had a lot on my mind that night. Our third baby was on the way. Third. The pregnancy had been an accident. As much as I had been putting on a happy face for friends and family, I was deeply uncertain about how things would play out, not just in terms of finances, but how I could possibly be a good father the third time around. Would I be able to provide the time this unborn child would need? I felt stretched, as it was, just raising two. And I have to admit, I had been looking forward to getting a few crumbs of my own life back as the kids got a bit older. Starting over again with a third felt like all those plans would have to be thrown away. In any case, I remember dwelling that night on these issues, just circling round in my head, and I dawdled as I walked and thought. I remember thinking about whether we'd be able to afford a bigger car or if we'd be able to even take the kids on holiday. I wasn't paying particular attention to where I was going. I was just walking as worries swirled around my head. I remember heading down a hill lit by some patchy streetlights and passing a couple of closed shops. I don't know if it was some sort of premonition considering what soon followed, but looking at the dead windows of my local newsagents and the bakers, I felt something sinister in the air, an absence of the living. This uneasiness was like someone dragging their nails down a chalkboard. I tried not to let the feeling eat away at me. I had enough on my mind as it was, but that strange psychological discomfort grew until I decided to go home and get some sleep. Taking the shortest route I could, I turned down another street and found myself walking towards a small play park that I sometimes took my sons to during the day. You know, some places are fine during the day, even inviting. Then they take a different tone once the sun has set and the shadows come out. Well, that night, the shadows had indeed come out. The play park was lit only by a couple of nearby streetlights, casting long shadows across a path and to the swings and other play park equipment. It was as empty as I'd ever seen it, and the climbing frame, seesaw and chute appeared like strange nightmarish shapes in the dark. I opened a small gate that would allow me to cut through the park to the other side, ensuring that I'd be in the warmth of my home soon enough. It would only take me a minute or so to cross the park. When I reached about halfway, I heard a familiar sound. I instinctively knew what it was. A sound I'd always associated with the joy of childhood, but not in this instance. In this instance, it only brought a nervousness to my frazzled mind. I looked to my side and saw no more than 5 or 6 metres away, the play area in the darkness. It was just as empty as it had been when I'd entered the park, but for one thing. The child's roundabout was turning by itself. Now, I have to tell you, if it had been the swings swaying back and forward, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Even though there was no wind to speak of, the air moves in strange, invisible ways, and though a vacant child's swing moving in the night has a little uneasiness about it, it could be explained away. But not in this case, however. Not with the roundabout. It was turning around by itself. Now I knew the feel of that roundabout. It was made of solid metal. I'd turned it in my hands many times with my boys, watching their faces grin in delight until it got a little too much for them and they had to stop due to being dizzy. But there was no delight here. The roundabout moved. It had a rhythmic squeak to it, like the thing could use some WD-40. As I stared at it, I watched it turn and turn and turn again in the darkness, its multicoloured painted surface a monochrome grey in the night. As I stared at its hypnotic revolutions, it was then that I suddenly realised I was no longer alone. I heard the distinct sound of movement to my side. A man in his 50s was standing beside me. I thought I must have been so transfixed by the turning of the roundabout that I hadn't heard him walking along the path. I was startled. I nearly jumped out of my skin, to tell you the truth. The man was dressed in either grey or black. He didn't look at me. He was gazing at the roundabout. "I used to push my daughter on that," he said in a monotonal voice. "Oh," was all I could say. At this point, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The roundabout kept turning in the darkness, kept spinning, but I didn't move away, not yet. I didn't want to turn my back on the man. There was something strange about him. He looked haggard and he was dressed for winter. The very look of him made me feel unsafe. I wasn't sure why. "She loved that thing," he said, pointing to the roundabout. "I've seen you here every now and then, with your boys. They love it too, don't they?" I didn't know what to say. I mean, he had watched me with my kids. You know, you get used to familiar faces when you're a parent. You strike up conversations with the other mums and dads. You might not learn everyone's name, but the faces become just as familiar as the park itself over time. I knew, staring at this man, that I had never seen him before that night. "Yeah," I replied. "They do love the park. Enjoy your walk." I turned slightly to leave, wanting to put as much distance between myself and the man and the spinning roundabout as possible. But he reached out and grabbed my arm. "She won't stop," he said, finally looking at me. His voice quivered with pain. "She won't let me leave." I tried to pull my arm away, but he wouldn't let go. "She won't let me," he said again. But this time his voice had changed. It had dropped a register, and I hate to use this description, but it sounded almost inhuman. Then the roundabout stopped. The man groaned and started walking towards the park, but he pulled at my arm as he did. I tried to free myself, but his grip was like a vice. "Let go," I kept saying, readying a clenched fist. "I don't want to hurt you." As he pulled me between the swings towards the roundabout, I felt this gaping terror enter my body. The roundabout, now deathly still, had a foreboding for me, and as we neared, I instinctively knew, that there was someone on it. They were waiting for me. The fear grew rapidly until I knew I had to escape, and so I struck the man in the face with my fist. I felt what I thought was flesh and tissue collapse under the impact, but there was no blood. I desperately struck again and again. Each time my fist pulverised the man's features. It felt like I was leaving a deeper and deeper hole, smudged in like child's plasticine, though I couldn't quite see the true horror in the dim light. This feeling made me almost sick with fear. He wasn't human, at least not anymore. And yet no matter how much I disfigured him, he just pulled me nearer to the silent roundabout. He never relented. Finally, as we reached the roundabout, he grabbed hold of the metal frame. A glint of light from the street nearby illuminated his face properly. There was nothing there now. No eyes, no nose, just a mouth and a strange, lifeless void in the middle of his face, like melted wax. I think I lost my sanity at that sight. I let out a cry for help, but the night seemed to snuff it out. Where there should have been an echo, there was nothing, as if we were confined in an otherworldly room, cut off from the environment around us. The man reached out, grabbed my hand, and yanked it towards the railing of the roundabout. I tried to fight, but he was too strong. He wrapped my fingers around the cold metal rail and said, "Push." With a shove, he moved me forward, and the roundabout began to move with me. The next thing struck at my very soul like a shard of ice. I heard a small girl's laugh in response. It was gleeful, yet filled with malice, a horrible inversion of happiness. The man chuckled along with that sound, and I am certain that I heard him say, "Thank God," in response. Somehow I knew that if I stayed there pushing that roundabout, that I would be just like him. I would replace that man. I would be held prisoner in that park to push the invisible ghostly child for eternity, night after night. I thought of my own kids, how I would never see them again. The madness had to stop. As a coldness began to shoot up my arms, I managed to wrench my grip away from the roundabout. I heard an ear-piercing scream like a child having a tantrum. The man reacted and tried to grab me once more, but I fell, smacking the back of my head against the metal frame of a swing. Dazed, I pushed myself backwards as the man searched for me in the darkness. He whimpered as he did. I rolled over quietly, and then I was on my stomach, exhausted, and scrambled over the cold ground to get away. I'm not sure how I made it, but when I finally tumbled out onto the nearest street, I came to my senses. Standing up, I looked across the small play park, and I am certain I saw the man pushing the roundabout again and again, and on it was the dim outline of a young girl in a white dress. There's no way for me to know if it was all real. I certainly had a bad bump on the back of my head from a fall, and my hands were cut up as though I had indeed pulled myself along the ground. But it's more than possible that the entire event was the product of stress, I suppose. The play park was, just a few months later, removed. The local council said it was hardly used and was no longer fit for purpose. I had my doubts about the official story, but it was certainly not fit for any living person. I stopped going for my nightly walks, and it was beginning to affect my mental well-being, so not long after this I finally brought myself to revisit the entire ordeal in the hopes that I could work through it. I did a little research into the history of the play park. There was no record of a young girl dying there, something I had thought about as an explanation, but I did find something else of equal interest. 23 years previous to my encounter, a local man and father of 3 had vanished from the area after going for a walk at night. He was last seen entering that small park. I am certain that no one ever saw him leave.